This episode of the AD History Podcast is brought to you by you, our amazing patron. Thank you for supporting the show and helping us create the AD history you deserve. We could not do it without you. Have you ever wondered who the real-life inspiration for Santa Claus is? Or just how awful Constantine's progeny was after his death? Well, do we have a story for you?
This is the AD History Podcast, weaving a tapestry of world history from 1AD to HD. Powered by TGNR. Get your good news that's real news at TGNR by visiting tgnreview.com. Now here are your hosts, Paul K. DiCostanzo and Patrick Foote.
And brought to you via London and New York City, you are listening to the AD History Podcast. I am Paul K. DiCostanzo, and I am joined by my co-host, Patrick Foote. And Patrick, how is everybody's AD History's favorite heel today?
Well, I'm the kind of heel you love to hate. And you told me before this, before we started recording, Paul, that you're wearing a Montreal baseball jersey from a defunct Montreal team. And they probably left because the city sucks. Am I right, everyone? Boo! Yes.
Ooh, he's playing heel. He's playing heel. Oh,
I'm mocking
you better watch
the
out for those
hometown.
French Canadians, man. They defend their pride to the last. Yes, the Montreal Expos. Just a short aside, I really do love collecting sports jerseys. I've always have. And one of the things I most prize are jerseys from teams that no longer exist. In this case, this is the road jersey for the Montreal Expos and one Vladimir Guerrero. And as a Yankees fan, more importantly, I am still a baseball fan. So I appreciate these things, and Guerrero was one of my favorite non-Yankee players. So yeah, just seems to make sense. I love this sort of stuff. It's Paul D to a T. But in any case, one is we just recently dropped the new video for the first episode, and it's really gone very well. But the thing that's really surprised me, at least on my front, Patrick, is that people are somewhat seeing it as a face reveal, at least on my part. They know what you look like, and which is strange because my photo is out there. You know, you type in my ridiculously long last name, or even my personal account that I'll comment with on YouTube when I don't choose to use the AD History account. My face is right there. And the one thing that you seem to be a bit surprised about is the beard.
Yeah, people really didn't see that coming. And welcome to the club, Paul. And trust me, face reveals. A lot of people tend to think face reveals just this one-time thing, but I've shown my feet. I think I've shown my face in my second video I ever made, and I do a weekly series where I show my face on Name Explain, and I still get comments going, "Whoa, I've never seen your face before." Trust me, people don't stop. People have their own. Everyone has their own little face reveal. So like, you'll be getting that comment for quite a bit of time coming, I imagine, if it's anything like my case.
Hey, I'm cool with that. I don't know what it is necessarily about my voice that doesn't suggest that I would be wearing a beard. Only you guys can tell me that wherever you're listening or watching. But that's we'll get back to that another time. Today, we're doing something that is very timely and very interesting, which is I'm going into the history of one St. Nicholas of Myra, which of course is the direct inspiration for Santa Claus. And that couldn't be more appropriate at this time. And you are tackling the dysfunctional progeny of now the late Constantine the Great.
Yeah, so Constantine's follower-up, his three sons. That's an interesting case there. It's a really fascinating thing. It's almost sad to an extent. Really interesting. Looking forward to sharing that with you all today.
No, that's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to that, to be sure. I always am. You always do great stuff here. And we're going to jump right into this. So wherever you're listening, with all of this done and out of the way, let's lay down our necessary, obligatory, now legendary AD History Podcast ground rules. 1. Evaluate events in the context they occurred. 2. Over the span of recorded history, the way it was recorded, its methodology, and the facts that are important have changed immensely. How we view history today is not necessarily how we viewed it 50 years ago. 3. Nothing in history was inevitable. And 4. History and the past is like a different country.
Okay, so Paul, it is officially December, and that means the holiday season is fast approaching. So what better way is there to bring in this most wonderful time of the year than talking about jolly old Saint Nick himself and his death?
I couldn't agree more, because in this particular decade that this particular episode covers, St. Nicholas of Myra, the main inspiration for the one that we know as Santa Claus, dies in 343 AD. But what we're going to try to do here is get past the saint and try to get to the man. It's not easy trying to get and punch through the hagiography when it comes to any saint. But whereas a hagiography is looking to extol their greater and more theologically significant virtues, we're looking as much for the human side of this. And it's not easy. But let me tell you a story, and you might even believe it. And I think it is best to set the scene. Perhaps one of the best and most important Christian saints that deeply influence and impact our modern HD world. None is known better than St. Nicholas of Myra. St. Nicholas of Myra is the primary inspiration that we know for Santa Claus. But why? Who was the man from which his all-important characters derive? What do we actually know about him? And the answer is not a hell of a lot in terms of the man himself. In time, he would apparently ascend to the post of becoming Bishop of Myra, which is located in modern-day Turkey. In fact, Turkey is very much, modern Turkey was Nicholas's homeland, where he would reach the greatest public prominence. And in addition to the influence of Santa Claus, Nicholas of Myra is the patron saint of countless professions and ways of life. And you'll find out more just in a bit. What St. Nicholas is most best known for is a particular story. And in this case, it goes as such. St. Nicholas of Myra, for reasons that we'll get into later, found himself a fairly wealthy young man. And he finds out about a businessman that has 3 daughters. There doesn't appear to be a mother in the equation, so it's a father and 3 daughters. And this fellow was apparently very, very wealthy, but had recently come into financial destitution. The story doesn't really go into why, but that's not even so important. What is important to know is that since he's become destitute financially, he has a serious problem. All 3 of his daughters at that period in time in that place are of marriage age. However, given some of the customs at the time, a daughter that you're looking to marry off, at least in his case, required a dowry, meaning there had to be some connection of tangible wealth involved with whoever the groom may be. And he couldn't provide that. And apparently the situation, as the story goes, emphasize as the story goes, he became so desperate he even began mulling the idea that he would have to put his daughters into prostitution. That's the severity of this.
Yeah, it's quite an extreme measure to have to go to.
Yes, and so apparently the young St. Nicholas finds out about this in his late teens, early 20s. And of course, as we will come to find, generosity and benevolence are very much, as you would imagine, a key portion of his character. So what he does is, late for the first night, he goes to the window of the house of the father with the 3 marriage-age daughters, and he tosses a bag of coins in through the window. And they wake up the next day and they see this here. They don't know how they got it, but they're overjoyed. And it's enough to serve as the dowry for one of his daughters. The next night, Nicholas comes back again, tosses it through the window. They wake up the next morning, mind totally blown, and it's enough for the dowry for 2 of his daughters. But at this point, the father is obviously becoming very curious as to who this anonymous benefactor actually is. And so he decides on this 3rd night, when Nicholas would come again, to be laying in wait, just to find out what's going on here exactly. Sure enough, Nicholas shows up, and as soon as he tosses it over, the dad is waiting there, and he's asking, why are you doing this? What's this all about? But the important thing in terms of the conversation that those 2 had is that Nicholas made one caveat. He wanted nothing in return. It was absolutely supposed to be an anonymous act of charity. The only thing Nicholas asked of the father was, tell nobody. He didn't want to be known for this. Not that he was worried about other people coming and trying to hit him up, which would be a realistic thing, all told.
Yeah,
if you win the lottery, generally you try not to advertise it, but I don't think that was the case here. I think, from what I understand, the idea behind the story itself, and it is a story, is the anonymous generosity. Let's put it this way. St. Nicholas would not have been a big fan of donating a whole bunch of money to a hospital and having a new wing named after him. That's not his thing. And
I think that's probably the way a lot of us want to be if we were to have money. I refuse to believe otherwise. I think most of us would want to be that level of wealthy, I suppose, and act like that if we were to come into wealth. So to show Nicholas doing that is incredible. It's a really great thing to see in this podcast, which is for so long just when people out for themselves more or less in one way or another.
So much self-interest.
Yeah, see someone who's got little to no self-interest is really refreshing.
It is. And so, as I was mentioning kind of briefly earlier, Nicholas of Myra is the patron saint to countless professions and ways of life. And I've done some looking into this, but some of them include sailors and fishermen, which will make sense a little bit, the falsely accused, which will definitely make a little bit more sense in a bit, brewers, and oddly enough, though I have found conflicting information on this, broadcasters.
That is so bizarre. Like, I wonder when he became the patron saint of broadcasters, because I can't imagine a broadcaster in any capacity existing before, at least even before radio came into being. I can't think of an old-fashioned equivalent. I know in ways that the word video existed in Latin, it means I see, so it kind of makes sense. In what concept did a broadcaster exist back then, or when did he become the patron saint of broadcasters, I wonder?
Well, that's really where it comes down to the conflicting information part. So, for the most part, interestingly enough, actually, the patron saint of communicators, which would be including broadcasters in this case, is actually attributed the patron saint being the Archangel Gabriel.
Okay.
So there's some conflicting information in here.
And that makes sense because obviously he communicated that message to Mary, I guess.
Yes, and I believe Pope Pius XII in the early 50s also appointed a patron saint of television as well. And it's a female saint as well. I forget her name, but I believe she's of Assisi, but that's not so important. However, I mean, it's either Nicholas or Gabriel. At least plausibly, he's our guy.
He is our guy.
He's our guy. And it's also interesting to note this. The other thing I learned recently is that as new developments come technologically in new professions, new ways of life, the church will appoint patron saints as is necessary. So it's not like a stone cold thing from the past. It's adaptive.
How fascinating. So there could be like just a flat out patron saint of podcasts or patron saint of YouTube at one point in the future.
Whoever that might be, goodness, I would like to see the steel cage match to determine that one, to be sure. I think that's the only way it can go down.
Yeah.
And everybody's got to shell out $100 to watch it on pay-per-view. But he's also the patron saint of brewers. And of course, as you would imagine, based on the story we just told, he is also the patron saint of prostitutes.
Yeah, the oldest profession in the books. A lot of people like to claim. So it's broadcasting, very modern, prostitution, very old. So got all his bases covered, that St. Nick.
Yeah, and there's a lot more too. Those are just the ones that I thought that would be the most interesting for our discussion. Though it should be noted in this case that it is extremely difficult to parse out the historically plausible accounts from hagiography, meaning biography of saints, for those who may not be familiar with the term. And though a hagiography is not historically insignificant, given the impact it may have on greater attitudes or events, they don't tell you that much of the very human side of the Satan equation. And, Nicholas of Myra right here is no different. So we start talking about his early life. Where did this guy come from? What is his background? And Nicholas was believed to have been born in Patara in coastal southwestern modern-day Turkey around 270 AD. And apparently Nicholas was the son of a very wealthy Greek family, likely making their personal fortune in commerce. And it is said that both of his parents were highly devout Christians, which you kind of expect to some degree, I suppose, who also had a great deal of trouble conceiving a child prior to Nicholas's birth. So he's kind of the golden treasure child that they had been working so hard. And there are many parents out there that can sympathize with such difficulties. This happened in antiquity. It happens in the modern day. I think it's a struggle that is very human, especially that it endures through time. However, as the legend of Nicholas goes, he was named after his uncle, who was also a Christian bishop. However, Nicholas was to lose his parents on the early side of life. We're literally talking like late teenagers, early 20s, which, as I mentioned, made him young and quite wealthy, though he did not mismanage his fortune as we so often see in these cases, both back then and today.
Yeah, today.
However, what he's best known for, unsurprisingly, is his remarkable generous nature, especially, as we mentioned, that anonymous generosity. We think back to that story of the dowry and him throwing it through the windows. I mean, that so clearly illustrates so many of the most important fundamental seeds of the figure that we know today in our HD world as Santa Claus.
And what I find interesting, Paul, is like, how much documentation do we have on this St. Nicholas? Did he actually exist, or has it just been, like you said at the start, that there's not a lot we know about him? Like, is there anything we know for sure? Did this guy actually exist?
So that had been a debate for a long time, but apparently they have found some documentation that did mention a certain interaction that he had that was written a little under a century after his particular acts, a little under a century after he died, written by essentially anonymous Greek authors. And it's believed possibly a fragment of a bigger work, but simply put, it hasn't been found. And of course, the other difficulty here is that nobody wrote about him while he was alive. And Patrick, I know this is a line that you and I and longtime listeners of AD history have run into more than once.
Yeah, it always seems to be the case, but that's just, we're in such early stages of AD history still in the grand scheme of things. Like, it's going to be hard to come across more definitive stuff, but let's err on the side of optimism and say St. Nicholas did exist. So we've heard the story of the three daughters, but like, did he do anything else to earn his legacy? Is there any other stories about this man other than just keeping some daughters happy and keeping them off the streets?
Well, that's really,
which is still obviously
really
a great thing
the
unto
extreme
itself.
of that story that makes it so dramatic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, so the answer is there's a number of them, and I'm not exactly sure where the process was at this particular point in time, but I know today, specifically, like say with the Catholic Church, they require 3 miracles in order to bestow canonization and make somebody a saint. And some of these stories undoubtedly, especially considering they directly connect to the patron saint of a particular profession or way of life, will make a lot of sense. And here's a few of them that are really the greatest one. And the last one we talk about is actually the most historically plausible one. And the first story in this case was the story of the calming of the storm at sea. Very, very Jesus of Nazareth in this respect. But it's not the Sea of Galilee in this kind of this. We're talking about the Eastern Mediterranean here. The main reason Nicholas is the patron saint of sailors and mariners and fishermen, as you'd imagine, as we mentioned before, is very likely due to the story including Nicholas traveling at sea. And as a young man of some wealth who obviously was very interested in Christianity before he ever came into the priesthood, became a bishop and all of that, he decided to use a portion of that wealth to go and visit the Holy Land, and he decided to travel by sea. And apparently during the trip, a great storm, a huge squall, hit the vessel that he was sailing on during his trip to Palestine. And as the story goes, Nicholas began to pray and pray and pray some more, after which the storm began to subside and the seas calmed. And all aboard credited Nicholas's prayer to saving their lives from that storm.
This reminds me so much of the story of Martin Luther, Paul, where Martin Luther supposedly was on a storm, on a boat in the middle of a storm, and he prayed to God saying, "Oh, if you calm this storm, I will become a monk." And the storm did calm. That led him on his own path to Christianity, away from the law, because he was originally a lawyer. There's a lot of similarities there, and I just find that interesting.
Yeah, he never lost that litigious quality about him, to be sure.
No, yeah.
I look forward to talking about him in the future when we finally get to.
Yes, yeah.
Anyway, so that most certainly would count, I would think, as what we would consider, at least in our minds. Oh yeah, that's definitely a miracle that you would hear pretty much from the Bible almost. No doubt it is, because Jesus, for all intents and purposes, did the same thing on the Sea of Galilee. The next thing he did, which could easily be a modern day miracle, might I add, in his later life, once he became Bishop of Myra, Nicholas was encouraged by some of the people of Myra to approach Emperor Constantine because the locals believed that their imperial tax burden was just too high. And of course, Nicholas kind of cultivating this idea as a saint of being a man of the people. He acted on this request and he sought a personal audience with Constantine himself, which in and of itself is pretty amazing and shows just how far Christianity has ascended that he could even arrange such a meeting with somebody in that level of power in Rome.
Yeah, and just the idea of when we think of people, or when we think of St. Nick interacting with other people, we think elves, Mrs. Claus, Rudolph, the rest of the reindeers, maybe the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny. We never think about St. Nick interacting with Constantine the Great, and that's just so crazy. It's obviously a lot more accurate than the other ones I suggested. I just think that's absolutely bonkers that Santa Claus talked to Constantine in real life. That's just great. And told him to lower taxes.
Well, here's the thing. Nicholas got the audience and managed to convince Constantine to lower the taxation rate of Myra significantly, after which Constantine gave Nicholas a signed and sealed decree to formalize this decision he had made. But there are two versions of the story from here. Whichever you choose to believe, both of them are kind of funny in their own right. So, the first one is, a day or two later, Constantine was approached by his financial advisors, telling him that they will miss out on an enormous amount of tax revenue should he let this new decree pass for Myra and all the taxation that would occur. However, apparently, Nicholas, shortly after his initial meeting with Constantine, then took the official decree and threw it into the sea. He threw it in the sea, presumably so it could never be returned, creating a fait accompli. So when Nicholas was called back to Constantine and Constantine tried to backpedal on this, the emperor could not rescind the document that nobody would ever be able to find because at this point it might as well not exist, which I think is kind of strange from a legal ace standpoint of view, but that's just how the story goes.
Yeah.
The second one, Nicholas was called back by Constantine only to be told by Constantine to Nicholas that he couldn't follow through. It's just too much. Nicholas then went to inform him that it was too late. His new taxation edict for Myra was already effect in Myra. And to verify this claim, Constantine dispatched a writer to witness this for himself and to confirm what Nicholas was saying is true, which apparently it was. Now, when I say this could easily be what we would call a modern miracle, imagine trying to pull this off with the IRS.
Yeah, it's quite the miracle.
Modern miracle.
To get taxes sorted out, like to get taxes lowered, that's a miracle unto itself.
Yeah, and on the decree of just a single human being, no less. If you've dealt with the IRS, and chances are if you're listening to this podcast, you can appreciate the gravity of this, of this story and possible miracle. Certainly a modern day miracle in our view.
Yeah.
Another story, of course, that he's known for, this is very much one that shows off his incredible zeal. And this actually, it takes place at the First Council of Nicaea that you and I talked so much about. And the whole Arian conflict, and is Jesus co-equal, or is he a subordinate deity made by God? Did he exist into eternity? If you've heard AD history in the last few episodes, these are concepts you are now very familiar with. So when he went there, he was very much on the side that opposed Arius, so Saint Alexander of Alexandria, the bishop, and the idea that he was co-equal with God. He lived, he was God made man, he died, he went back into this non-corporeal form, and he existed like God from the beginning. They're one and the same. And this, of course, this whole thing that got called by Constantine, that he oversaw at least part of it, and invited a ton of Christian bishops from the empire. I think they said they invited as many as 800, maybe it was 1,800.
It makes sense for him to be there.
It makes total sense for him to be there. And so, as you can imagine, this must have been a grueling affair going back and forth on this particular point. And in the case of, Nicholas, he got so fed up and so angry at Arius that he literally got up and smacked him across the head. Constantine was not amused. And it seems, if I understand correctly, that St. Nicholas of Myra was defrocked for a time and even thrown in prison for a short time.
Gosh, Santa in jail.
Yeah, Santa in prison. Can you possibly believe it? Yeah, Constantine was definitely not amused.
No.
But you know what? Who could be that surprised? And, who is he to judge in this case? My goodness, he's done a lot worse than that.
Yeah, he can't.
Goodness.
Yeah, that's the least of his worries.
And so how do we know Nicholas was here? Well, basically, there are several rosters of attendees, though, as I mentioned in the episode about the Council of Nicaea, there's not a definitive number of how many attended, but there is one roster that shows the attendance of 200 bishops, and there's a few other that have 300. And though Nicholas of Myra is not on the one of the 200, apparently he appears in a few of the rosters that include 300 attendees. So this is another scrap of evidence here that's talking, that's speaking to, there was a St. Nicholas of Myra, just establishing that as I understand it. But we get to a point, since we're talking about historical documentation and really getting into the hard history of this, we're now getting to the story that most certainly gives the most historical plausibility, because it has to do with an act that he did, which I suppose in a way is a miracle, but once again, it could easily be a modern day miracle as well. And that is the Praxis Dei Stratolatus, which, of course, translated from Latin into English, is the practice of military officers. And this, is, like I said, was the portion that is accredited to an anonymous Greek author right around the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century. So this is the closest thing we have to written documentation that is at least remotely close to St. Nicholas of Myra's life. So in this case, the story surrounds a trio of Roman soldiers that were sentenced to death as seemingly innocent men occurring in or near Myra. What exactly they were accused of, I do not know, nor is it entirely clear to me on what basis they were believed innocent. However, apparently Nicholas was entirely convinced of their innocence. When Nicholas found out about their plight and confirmed that they were still alive, he rushed to the site of the execution. And upon arrival, the 3 soldiers were already bound and hooded and awaiting the executioner's axe. Now that really paints a picture in your mind, does it not?
Yeah, it does, rather, that final moments.
And it is said that Nicholas physically held back the first blow of the executioner's axe. And somehow, based on the fact that bishops most certainly had a lot more personal power in these days, they represented the community they served in both spiritual and civil matters. The whole concept of the separation of church and state doesn't come, at least as we know it, until much later on, through the European Renaissance, and not the Renaissance, but the European Enlightenment. So he's able to kind of exercise some kind of authority in a number of fields, and this apparently would be one of them. But in any case, he managed to stay the execution. And after this, Nicholas made haste and quickly sought out the local Roman governor to get to the bottom of this case, because that Roman governor was the one who had convicted them. And when he did, the governor begged for forgiveness and claimed to Nicholas that he was forced to condemn these men on the instruction of a pair of local administrators. Nicholas was not yet entirely satisfied of what was going on here and decided to do some deeper digging. After Nicholas did his further digging, he came to find that the local governor that he spoke to condemned the 3 soldiers and that he was indeed bribed to do so. And you can imagine this did not sit well with Nicholas. I'd like to think this wouldn't have sat well with anyone.
Yeah.
And he basically told the guy that he was going to take this case directly to Constantine due to the corruption involved. After that, the governor literally begged Nicholas to change his mind. And Nicholas chose to change his mind and not bring it to Constantine's attention, though he made it very clear that they would be released and that he would never forgive nor forget what had occurred there.
That is a very dramatic story, Paul. But so why is this more historically plausible? You sort of said this is a very much more defined thing, but why is this? Why have we got more evidence for this one behind, say, the three daughters and the money and the money in the bags?
It comes to that very near Greek anonymous author account of this. And it's also pretty much, as I understand it, the first story of St. Nicholas of Myra that was actually translated from Greek into Latin.
Mm-hmm.
And that Latin speakers would have first learned of St. Nicholas of Myra. It's not great evidence because you want a lot more. And on top of that, it's very likely it could have been part of a greater work that talked about Nicholas.
Okay.
We may never know that.
Yeah. But
it's definitely considered the most historically plausible of all of these great stories that are attributed to him.
And just out of curiosity, is there any other documentation minus this sort of stuff? Like anything else that we can further prove his existence?
Well, when we start getting into the topic of proving existence in this case, there was one issue that had cropped up for a very long time, which is that there are two very prominent St. Nicholases. And as I understand it, both of those Nicholases are extremely prominent and important in the Orthodox side of Christianity. And if I'm correct, also specifically the Russian Orthodox sect of Christianity. And for some time, apparently, there was some merging of these two. Now, here's the thing. The St. Nicholas that I'm talking about that they got them confused with is known as St. Nicholas of Scion, who lived just about 2 centuries after St. Nicholas of Myra. And the case of St. Nicholas of Scion, he died in 564 AD. And it's important to note in this case that he was a monk, whereas St. Nicholas of Myra was just a bishop. He was not a monk in any way. And so for a long period of time, they started getting merged into a single individual with their acts, deeds, and words attributed to both sides of really this hybrid figure at this point. Now, there are two things that are important to note. As I said, Nicholas of Myra, not a monk. No. Nicholas of Scion was a monk. And any time, apparently, as I understand it, insofar as writing exists about the two, especially the more historically plausible stuff, Nicholas of Myra is referred to as hagios, which is the type of saint that would be for somebody that wasn't a monk. Mm-hmm. But now there's also one other thing that I found that was quite interesting, is that, and apparently this came recently, I think there's some validity to it based on what I've seen, because for a long time, a lot of religious history scholars and theologians began to think that maybe Nicholas of Myra didn't exist. Apparently they found an account where Nicholas of Scion, it was written that he actually traveled to Myra, obviously after Nicholas of Myra's death, to go visit and celebrate the feast of St. Nicholas of Myra.
And fun fact, Paul.
Two guys.
Fun fact, Paul. I just realized, I just did some checking myself. Today, the day we're recording this, is St. Nicholas's feast day.
No kidding.
Yeah, it's either the 5th or the 6th in the West. So we'll take that.
Oh, yeah, because you're dealing with the... Yeah, okay, I understand. Well, Patrick, everybody listening or watching, happy St. Nicholas of Myra Day.
Yeah, happy St. Nicholas of Myra Day.
And that's a great... Oh, man,
yeah,
good
and just
on
when you
I
mentioned his
that.
feast just then, I was this is literally his feast day.
You couldn't have made that any better,
no,
right?
No, it's quite together. Unfortunately, when this comes out, it won't be the same day, but we're recording on the day, and that's what matters.
Yes, it is. So from what I understand, it's reasonably certain from a historical standpoint that these were two distinct characters living two distinct lives a couple of centuries apart. There's nothing I think is more funny than the idea that you and I in our life could get wrapped up in the life of somebody who has a very similar name that did very similar things, but so happened to be living in the early 19th century,
like that time I got rid of all the snakes in Ireland, Paul. It was just a massive coincidence.
You still have to tell me how you pulled that
Yeah,
off.
well, it was just a coincidence, man. I had a big rake. I can't just push them aside. It was just a big coincidence. Just having to be called Patrick and do the same thing. No.
Well, I could not be happier that my birthday falls on your day.
Exactly.
On your day.
It all connects. But one last thing I want to say is we all know the myth of St. Nick, Jolly old St. Nick, Father Christmas, Santa Claus. I want to hear more about, I want more people to celebrate the actual life of the real, well, we'll say real for all intents and purposes, real St. Nicholas, because it's one of fascination. Imagine like a proper, like, I won't call it a Christmas film, like a proper adaptation, retelling of this man's life, battling with Constantine, saving these people. I think there's such an amazing story to be told there. Maybe it has been told and I haven't looked at the right places, but it's such an incredible story to be told there about the real Saint Nick. And Paul, thank you very much for sharing it, not just with myself, but with the AD listener, with the AD audience-ship.
Well, you know what?
History audience. Blur got there in the end.
You know, just all the stars aligned on this one. And I do find a certain personal interest in trying to hash out, you know, effectively the saint and the man and getting a better idea of who he was. But more importantly, I really wanted to give the listeners some grounding and greater understanding of the one that we so often take for granted culturally, which of course is the figure of Santa Claus. You know, if you're Christian, you obviously, you know, grow up with Christmas. Even if you're not, it still happens. Like look at Japan.
Yeah,
they well, I would say they probably are more into the very gift giving part of it, but they still celebrate the holiday. They understand the generosity part of it, and they put their own cultural adaptation to it, which I love seeing things like that. That is so cool. And in this case, you can kind of see where Nicholas of Myra and Father Christmas, Santa Claus, Pa Noel, you can see where the overlap is on the fictional imaginary Venn diagram and how it came about. But of course, one of the big things that I still find just funny as hell is that literally this St. Nicholas, the original St. Nicholas of Myra, literally was growing up on the shores of the beautiful Eastern Mediterranean, whereas the Santa Claus we know is literally relocated up in the Arctic Circle.
Yeah, like it's quite far from the home we're associating with. This was a very Mediterranean Father Christmas, and I'm a big fan of that.
Hoorah, no doubt. So I am very happy to have shared this all with you, and of course you, Patrick.
Thank you.
And wherever you may be listening, whether you celebrate Christmas or you do not, but certainly you're quite familiar with Santa Claus. I think it's pretty darn impossible in most cases, and a lot of places in the world, certainly in the West, to not be familiar with them, even if you aren't Christian, and taking that moment to say, okay, yeah, I think I get where this is coming from now. This makes more sense. This is definitely one of those important micro-narratives that we like to focus on that make the greater macro-narrative that create our HD world. And with that, we'll be back right after a word from one, Anna Domini.
This is the AD History Podcast. Keep up with the show and join the discussion by following AD History on Twitter with the handle @ADHistoryPC and the hashtag ADHistory. Check us out over on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube by searching AD History Podcast, as well as, of course, tgnreview.com/ADHistoryPodcast. Also, check out the AD History Podcast on Patreon. See how you can help support the show and the rewards that await you by exploring the AD History Podcast on Patreon. See the link in the description. Now, back to Paul and Patrick.
Now, Patrick, obviously we've talked about Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, Constantine the Great, Constantine the son of Constantius I, but eventually he would perish, as we mentioned in our prior episode. And what did that mean? That meant that it was taken over by his progeny. And needless to say, that was an interesting affair. So, with all of that in mind and all of this out of the way, Mr. Foote, Sir Patrick, you have the floor.
Thank you, Paul. So, yeah, this is where things kind of take a turn for Rome once again. So as we covered in the last episode, by 340 AD, Constantine had met his end. He was long dead. But not only did he reunify the empire under one emperor, he also set Rome and, of course, in turn, modern Europe on the path to Christianity that we're still in to this day. Europe, the Western Roman Empire, by and large, still a primarily Christian continent. So, how could anyone follow up that act? Well, simply put, one person didn't. Constantine's destruction of Diocletian's tetrarchy meant that the title to emperor was once again inherited through heirs, through sons, through adopted sons. However Rome got there, but that was gone.
Yeah, we keep coming back to this.
And that Constantine left 3 sons behind. And which one of them would become emperor? Well, here's the thing, Paul. All 3 of them did. And upon his death,
oh boy.
Yeah, it feels like I've only watched a couple episodes of Succession, but I'm getting those sort of vibes from this. If you watch any of Succession,
this does not appear to be what we like to call a lasting formula for stability. If the history we've covered is any indication so far.
Yeah, so upon his death, the 3 sons of Constantine split the empire between themselves and ruled over these separate areas. And if there's one thing brothers are best known for doing with one another, it's fighting. And normally this comes out in the form of competitiveness and play wrestling. And Paul, me and you are both siblings of solely brothers, so this one kind of hits. So especially I'm one of 3 myself.
Well, in this case, you are the youngest of 3. I am the oldest of 2.
Yeah.
So I know exactly what it's like. But luckily, my brother and I, whom you are all now familiar with, of
course, yeah,
are the closest of friends. So. Well, early on, believe me, we fought and injured each other quite significantly in the process, but eventually that passed. But luckily, well, not luckily, luckily for us, but in this case, these sons of Constantine certainly did not grow out of it.
No, and Paul, you and your brother, and me and my brothers, we didn't have an empire to rule either. And they still about the bedroom, of course, who got the top bunk.
Well, I always got the one I wanted, and usually it meant the top bunk. Basically, it was, if you could dethrone me from up there, it's all yours, and he never could.
As the elder sibling, Paul, I'm sure you always got the top bunk, and I'm sure you always got the nicer PlayStation controller.
I was never like that. We always had good PlayStation controllers between us. Amazingly, there was a lot of sharing and cooperation, but we still did beat the hell out of each other. Why? Because we were brothers.
Exactly. So from mine and Paul's own experiences of being brothers, it's suffice to say, this joint rulership of 3 brothers didn't go too well. But before we talk about these 3 brothers, it's worth talking about the 4th son. I say the 4th son, he was actually the first son. This was Crispus, or Crispus, however we pronounce that here. And
I like Crispus.
Crispus, let's go with Crispus. It sounds close to Christmas, doesn't it? We're in December.
Yes, and crispy.
And crispy, yes. And he was Constantine's firstborn with his first wife of Minervina. And he was born in around 300 AD, but died in just 326 AD. And his death, the death of Constantine's first son, is a absolutely wild story, if it's true, that being. It's for Crispus was sentenced to death by his very own father. And this is because Crispus was having an affair with Constantine's second wife, Fausta. Imagine, I don't even know if I want to imagine that. Imagine,
yeah. Talk about keeping it in the family.
Yeah, but there is a theory that this wasn't actually happening, and it was a conspiracy theory Fausta set up, saying, "Hey, I've been sleeping with your eldest son, Constantine. Your eldest son's been sleeping with me," to get Crispus killed. And it's just one of those crazy stories we won't ever know the full details of.
Unfortunately so. I mean, well, to some extent, to be sure. But, yeah.
We've got to ask ourselves, why would...
Please go on.
No, we've got to ask ourselves, why would Faustus want Crispus dead? And I guess...
Well, this is a good question, because why would she?
I guess, I mean, this is my own theorizing, but by the time Crispus... By this time, by 326 AD, so... Constantine was married to Fausta, and he would definitely have had at least one child. No, let me see. Yeah, he had already had all 3 sons with Fausta. Of course, if Crispus was still alive, he would have had way more claim to the empire than Faustus's own children. So I guess that's probably why she'd want him dead, so her children could get the throne, as opposed to this firstborn of Constantine, who hereditarily would have been more likely to take it.
I just had just the most ridiculous thought, and if you're going to understand this, because it's basically kind of coded in euphemism, I hear this whole story and all of the kind of intricacies of it, and who's in whose bed and who wants who dead. When I hear this, the first thing that came to mind, and I'm not going to lie, is what's known as Rule 34.
Yeah,
you know Rule 34.
I'm familiar with Rule 34, Paul. Yeah,
we're not going to explain that. You can look it up on your own. All I thought when I saw that, I was like, "Oh man, that's so Rule 34."
Yeah, that's some history zone Rule 34. There, it was happening way before the internet was ever happening.
The Romans did Rule 34 to death before there was such a thing. Goodness gracious.
Yeah. So
gross tangent over. No, please go ahead.
So let's introduce these actual sons. So it's worth mentioning there was a fourth son, but he's not. Yeah. But by the time Constantine is dead, Crispus is well and truly dead. So let's meet the three sons who would go on to become co-emperors. And these are all three sons. They were all born. They were all mothered by Fausta, that second wife of Constantine. And so keep track with me here, guys. We're going to go over this multiple times because it can get convoluted otherwise. The eldest of these three was Constantine II, and he was born in 316 AD. A second son was born the following year, Constantius II. He was born in 317 AD. And finally, in circa 320 AD, his third son of Constans was born. We'll go over those again because it's clear to see that from the names he gave those three sons, he had clearly had quite high hopes for them.
Oh my God, imagine trying to call them to dinner.
Yeah.
Constantine, Constantius, dinner's ready. My goodness. Yeah.
So something else I wondered is why didn't he give Crispus this name of Constantine? Because you'd think the first son you'd have will become Constantine II, right? That's kind of in my head. You'd call your firstborn child, your firstborn son, the second.
That's usually how it goes down, but clearly not here. And so why didn't he give that? Why was that not bestowed?
So my theory on this is that I checked Crispus was born before Constantine became emperor, and I can't remember Constantine's early life. Don't know how much he had been emperor in the bag from so on. So perhaps Crispus was born when Constantine didn't know if he would become emperor or not. So he thought, I won't bother giving him a fancy name, that sort of thing.
Crispus, let's see here. When was Crispus born again?
Crispus was born around 300 AD.
Okay, yeah. So we're talking about a good decade before he would end up getting into that Roman Civil War that led to the Battle of Milvian Bridge.
Yeah.
This sounds like it was from a time either A, when he was still in the court of Diocletian or Galerius, or when he managed to free himself from that court and follow his father Constantius up to Gaul and later Britain. So this Crispus definitely predates that true ascension that you see after the Battle of Milvian Bridge and the end of the Civil War with Maxentius.
Ascension is a great term. Yeah, Crispus was pre-Constantine's ascension. So he thought, I'm not going to call this one Constantine II because there probably won't need to be a Constantine II, but by the time the actual Constantine II was born, there was much more reason to have that, to have them in place.
Undoubtedly so. Undoubtedly so.
And of course, it's also incredible, as well as there being a fourth son, there were two daughters with Fausta too, and this was... So we had Constantina / St. Constance, as she would become known as, and Helena. Helena was the youngest of all of these. And I believe Constantina came between Constantius II and Constance. So when Constantine II, Constantius, Constantina, Constance, Helena, I believe.
My God, can there be an ounce of creativity here?
No. And so, as I mentioned, Constantina, I didn't do too much research into this, but she became quite a big deal unto herself. She became Saint Constance.
That's an accomplishment.
I believe in the Middle Ages, Saint Constance became quite a big deal. I'm sure it's something we can delve into either in what we missed.
I would be very curious about how that came about.
No, it's really interesting stuff, either in what we missed or when it becomes more appropriate. When she has her own ascension in Christianity, clearly because she becomes a saint. We can cover that. But of course, these daughters are people in their own right. But unfortunately, in ancient Rome, being a woman, unfortunately, didn't get you as far as it did being a man. So their story, yeah, unfortunately, now the empire was given to them simply because of their gender, and that was the time. That was that time in history for
That's 1,700 years ago in ancient Rome.
exactly.
What do you want us to tell you?
Exactly, yeah. But let's focus on these three sons for now. It's just worth mentioning those two daughters as well.
Absolutely.
They would have spent most of their lives knowing the empire would be theirs. And actually, they even held rank in the empire under their father.
Interesting.
They were all given the title of Caesar. So Constantine II became Caesar at age 7. And he became commander of Gaul at age 10. And Constantius II, he was made Caesar around the same age too. And from what I can gather, Constance became Caesar a little later, around the age of 13.
Ooh, that is a lot of responsibility thrown onto the shoulders of the child. Not that they're actually in the business of ruling at that point.
No.
But still, I mean, that's a lot to throw on a kid.
Yeah, and this was something because obviously the whole title of Caesar very much came about with Diocletian and the Tetrarchy, but the Tetrarchy.
I mean, they had it before, but they kind of repurposed it for the Tetrarchy and how that sort of hierarchy worked with that being one of the levels of administration and rule.
Yeah, but by now, like, the Tetrarchy's gone, so what does being a Caesar even mean at this point? And from what I could gather, it didn't mean much. It was a title emperors gave to their heirs, basically. Whoever they felt was going to take over them, they would call their Caesar, which kind of relates to its use during the Tetrarchy, but Constantine could have given it to anyone. It makes most sense to give it to his children. It's basically kind of like Prince at this point. It's like
I mean, they're operating like royalty essentially.
Yeah. They all knew what their life had in store for them when their father died, and of course that happened in 337 AD. So I just want to go over this again, just to be clear, because this is when things start to get a bit convoluted.
I think that's awfully important. So have at it, man. This is necessary stuff.
Constantine II was the firstborn. Constantius II was the secondborn, and Constance was the thirdborn. It's just worth drilling that into your head, as the story might get a bit confusing if you forget who is who, and just blame Constantine for giving his kids such similar ridiculous names. But
yeah, it kind of reminds me of Deion Sanders, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
giving all their kids, it's either Dion or Diana.
Yeah, just it'll get confusing if you just remember that Constantine II, Constantius II, Constance, in that order. That's how these kids were born, and they're the three key players. It's just annoying their names are so freaking similar. But let's get on
undeniably.
No,
but thank you for clearing it up.
That's fine. It's just one of those things, because I would get confused. I know I would get confused. So let's go into splitting up the empire. So in his death, Constantine left the empire to these three sons. However, they did not rule it as one unit like his father did. The empire was split into not 2 ways, but 3 ways. Each brother received an area of land to rule as their own. So Constantine II, who is Paul.
Constantine II is what, the second-born?
The firstborn.
He's the firstborn. See, even I'm having trouble keeping up with this.
No, it was the second. So Constantine II, the firstborn, he got Britannia, Gaul, and Hispania. Constance, who is thirdborn.
I thought, okay. God,
just Constance. So it's my pronunciation.
Okay, yeah.
Just Constance is the third.
I'm having a moment here, folks. I'm having a senior moment.
He kind of got the eastern half of Western Rome. So primarily the Italian peninsula, but some of the Balkans as well. Sort of modern day Croatia, that sort of area. And Constantius II, who is?
Constantius II is the second-born.
Is the second-born. He got the east, so he got modern Turkey, Greece. He got Constantinople itself, so that's how the empire was split.
I mean, that's interesting, actually, when you stop and think about it, because that really is the most prosperous place in the empire.
Exactly, and Constantius II, well, we'll see what he does with the east.
Is it possible to extrapolate some sort of favor by Constantine towards Constantius II based on the territory that he was given?
Potentially. So I didn't do full research into this. I'm not 100% sure it was Constantine I who left them these areas. I think they may have agreed upon them themselves. And if they did, it shows that Constantius II was clearly the best at arguing, because he clearly got the best chunk here. He got all the east.
So it would appear.
Yeah. So from what I could gather, I think they agreed for these areas themselves. Constantius II was either they realized he was the best, because spoiler alert, he's the one we're going to be hearing most of, Constantius II, that middleborn.
Surprise, surprise, surprise.
Yeah, middleborns, eh?
Yes.
No offense to any middleborn watching. But yeah, he clearly either had the persuasive power to get the East, or they realized, no, you're the best of the three of us, you take the East. But it's also worth noting that when they became emperors, they were 21, 20, and 14 years old. So they were quite young. And of course, Constance, that youngest, was just 14, and he wasn't actually allowed to be emperor at this time. So that meant that Constance, the third youngest, the youngest, he had to have Constantine II, the firstborn, as his regent. So Constantine II had basically all of Western Rome until he stopped being the regent.
Interesting. Now, the three brothers had all other male relatives of their grandfather killed, as I understand it?
Yeah, so I read a few sort of conflicting stuff with this. This is one of the first things they actually did. They kind of wanted to make sure they had no usurpers, no one else who could also claim the empire. So they thought, if we just kill all the male siblings, that will deal with them. I believe there were two they didn't kill, their mothers. I think it was their mother's nephews, and they basically had them under house arrest in their palace or something like that. I read.
So, where does Christianity come into this all again?
Yeah, Christianity is just what they follow, I suppose. In theory,
like I said,
yeah,
it just blows me away.
Mm.
I mean, it's not a surprise. You and I are very familiar with this kind of history, but still,
yeah, there's just a lot of similar stuff going on here. So let's dig into their time as emperors. So by 340 AD, Constance felt he was old enough to rule without Constantine II as his regent. So by now he would have been about 17, I think 17, 18 he would have been by now. So he felt, hey,
classic teenager.
Yeah, I don't need you anymore, man. And Constantine II didn't fully agree, but accepted this. And it was also around this year that Constantius II over in the East wanted help in the East. Constantius II called upon his eldest brother, Constantine II, to help with an attack on the Sassanids, because obviously Constantius II was in the East. He had the Sassanid Empire, Shapur II, right on his tail over there. And he wanted his eldest brother, Constantine II, who had Britannia, Gaul, and Hispania, to come lend a hand, because that's what big brothers are for, right? Helping you beat up the bullies.
Totally thing to do. Yes.
So Constantine II gladly accepted this invitation. And of course, this required him to travel from the very west of the empire all the way to the east. And this, of course, included going through his youngest brother's, Constance, included going through his land. And bitter after no longer being regent, he decided while on these journeys to attack Constance's land just as he passed through. This did not work out for Constantine II, however, as Constance actually expected this attack and launched his own unexpected ambush on Constantine II. And this ambush was too much for Constantine II, and he died here in 340 AD. So the youngest brother killed the eldest brother. So that's kind of not what I think many of us would expect. But yeah, the youngest sibling had it. Yeah, he had the upper hand on the eldest. Yeah.
Clearly, Constans did know what to expect and was ready for it.
And in Constantine II's death, Constans took control over his dead brother's land. So Constans had the entire Western Empire. So that left us with two sons of Constantine left. We had Constans in the west and Constantius II in the east. That's one brother down, two remaining.
Dun, dun, dun.
And tensions ran high between Constans in the west and Constantius II in the east. And as I hinted towards Paul, one of the things they felt bitterly different about was religion. They were both Christian, like their father, but they followed different sects and beliefs in Christianity. One of those things being about the Arian belief. I can't remember who landed on what side, but they had different ideas about what elements of their previous pagan religion should carry on into Christianity. Various things like that. Tensions were high.
If I remember correctly, and don't take me to court on this, but I'm fairly sure, in the case of Constantius II,
Mm.
out in the east. He was actually a patron of the Arian Christian idea.
That I will take your word for that, Paul, because like I said, I couldn't find out the specifics in my brief research, but it was definitely one of them was Arian, one of them was not. And they
Ye-
even argued about the issues their father had ironed out back in 325 at the Council of Nicene. Like these two were just arguing over everything that this sort of as the established Christianity their father had put together. They were ripping to shreds, and a religious civil war felt inevitable. But that actually never came to be because in 345 AD, Constantius II just said, "Hey, Constance, just do Christianity your way. That's fine." And for some reason, he just felt it wasn't something worth fighting over. And while
That's an unlikely outcome for what seems to be a religious crusade that was about to be the ultimate showdown. But
yeah, even for
that's
my
a left turn.
yeah, my sources said we don't exactly know why Constantius II just let it happen. We don't know why he just did. And while Constance got his way with Christianity, other issues faced him. And these issues came in the lands he claimed by defeating his brother Constantine II. This part of his empire, this new part that he got by killing his brother, it felt neglected. And this neglect manifested itself in the form of one Magnesius. Magnesius was an army commander born in Gaul, and he was deeply unhappy with the lack of attention Constance was giving Gaul, as well, of course, Hispania and Britannia, and
Yeah.
he wanted him gone. And many clearly agreed with him as support for Magnesius grew tremendously. And this kind of feels familiar, Paul. It feels like almost a return of the Baroque emperors.
It is, and in so many ways, we've gone through the Gaul equation before.
Mhm.
You know, we in some way, on some level, we've heard this tune on another occasion, and when these provinces feel like they are being neglected and ultimately having to fend for themselves,
Mm.
that's usually a good initial recipe for someone like Magnesius.
Yeah, and yeah. So, and while he feels a lot like a Baroque emperor, he will never actually gain the title of emperor. So, in 350 AD, Constance was visiting Gaul. I believe he was hunting. He was doing a hunting trip in Gaul, which clearly shows you how much attention he gave it. It was his playground basically. He went there to hunt.
So it would appear.
Yeah. And it was here that Magnesius striked. Although he didn't actually strike himself, he actually hired assassins to kill this young emperor while he was in Gaul. And they seem to have done this pretty easily. And with Constans dead, Magnesius was the de facto ruler of Western Rome. And like I said, he was never deemed an emperor. I believe his Wikipedia page uses that wonderful title of usurper, which is a great
Well,
word.
that's exactly what he was.
He was. And that's what all these Baroque emperors more or less were. But they got the title of emperor. But no, he didn't get that title.
You know, as far as Magnesius is concerned, though, it sounds like he had some rather valid gripes here.
Oh, of course he did. Yeah, like Constans didn't do anything with Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia. He just let them be. He was more focused on the land he had initially, that Italian peninsula. Who can blame? Like, I'll say who can blame him, but that was the birthplace of the empire. I know Rome itself was way past its prime by now. It was all going on in Constantinople.
Yeah.
But you got to feel some importance to Rome still. You would give Rome more attention, I feel.
It's
that's
the eternal city, but
yeah.
you know how it is with Rome at this point. I mean, right now we have one son that remains and we have one usurper.
Yeah, so that gets us to the end of the decade this episode is about. So it's quite well timed that Constance died in 350 AD, I think, Paul, because that really helped our podcast here.
Without a doubt. I'm sure it happened just that way for just that reason.
Mm-hmm. So by 350 AD, there was just one son remaining, Constantius II. And he had all of Eastern Rome, but things were not looking good either side to him. In his west, he had Magnesius the usurper, and of course, to his east, he had the Sassanids. And this
Not enviable.
Yeah, and this is a real rock and a hard place situation, and it would come to a head in the next decade, which we'll talk about next episode, I'm sure. But I just love how at the start of this episode, we had 3 sons. Now we have just one. They literally died perfectly. Like, it's just fascinating. It sounds like a work of fiction. It sounds almost like Shakespeare, doesn't it?
It's
almost like King Lear. Yeah, it's got
it
like
definitely has a Shakespearean sense to it.
Yeah.
Which so many of these, hey, let's put it this way: he did write Julius Caesar, so clearly he was thinking like we were, right?
Yeah, it reminds me. You had the 3 daughters in King Lear, that sort of thing. It reminds me so much of all that sort of stuff.
That's actually a really good connection on your part. Good on you.
I'm glad my A-level English literature pays off for something, Paul.
It would eventually.
And I think if there's any lesson to take home from this one, and Paul, you won't understand this, but just don't trust middle siblings.
I will only take your word for that.
They're a strange being, middle siblings. No, and Constantius II was the winner in all this. If winner is the correct term, he's lost 2 brothers, bless him, but he seemed to not really get on too much with them. It's just fascinating to see that one unified empire that Constantine established is already starting to crumble. I mean, spoiler alert, it's going to kind of come back in the next decade, but it was his own sons, no less, his own flesh and blood, the ones he had dubbed the ones he'd basically all called Constantine in some way, shape, or form. It was those who started this decline once again.
I'm looking forward to you picking up on this in our next episode because it's Shakespearean.
It really is. It really is Shakespearean.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Next time, we'll finish it out. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a lot of fun. And with that, us here, you there, we'll be back right after a word from Anna Domini.
This is the AD History Podcast.
Well, that does it for us today. Patrick, where can people find us?
You can find me personally primarily on Instagram at NameExplainYT. But you can also find me on Twitter at NameExplainYT, and of course on YouTube, search NameExplain. What about you, Paul?
In addition to my usual work at TGNR at tgnreview.com, you can find me at my Twitter handle at PKD in History, as well as my reader-submitted World War II Q&A column, The World War II Brain Bucket, where I answer all World War II-related questions, which if you are on YouTube, we will have a link down in the description.
That's all today from myself. Goodbye, thank you, and take care.
Yes, thank you all so much. Until next time.
Like all good things, we come to an end for today. Thank you for listening to the AD History Podcast. It is listeners such as yourself who make this show possible and truly awesome. Be sure to follow and subscribe for upcoming AD History podcast episodes, available wherever podcasts are found. Also, follow AD History on social media. Follow the show on Twitter at the handle at ADHistoryPC, as well as on Facebook by visiting facebook.com/ADHistoryPodcast and Instagram as AD History Podcast. In addition to liking and subscribing on YouTube by searching AD History Podcast. Do you have a direct comment or question for Paul and Patrick? Drop them an email at adhistorypodcast@tgnreview.com. Also, be sure to visit the show's homepage at tgnreview.com/ADHistoryPodcast. For Paul and Patrick, thank you for listening to the AD History. We'll see you again next time in the ever-growing tapestry of world history.